Hello, you fucking guys. I am so excited for this episode. So, firstly, I haven't filmed an episode since the beginning of the spring semester, and it is now April 12th, and we're towards the end of the semester because I've spent the entire semester posting the episodes that I already had banked. And that means we have lots of updates because it's been a while since I've talked to you guys. Today's episode is going to be all about diet breaks and refeeds, and we're going to go through the research that we've looked at in order to determine whether they're kind of favorable to implement during a fat loss phase. But before we get into the science, some personal updates. So throughout the episodes, I've been talking to you guys about the research that we do in Dr. Campbell's lab, in the Performance and Physique Enhancement Lab. And I've really focused on the 2 reverse dieting studies that we did. You guys kind of heard the inception of these studies, from the survey study to the intervention study. And since we've had some gaps in these podcast episodes, I have some really exciting news. So first and foremost, we finished the survey study. We closed it up. We got a lot of, and it helped us operationally define what reverse diets look like in the field and what the size of the weekly caloric increases are actually looking like as people implement refeeds in their clients, bodybuilders, lifestyle athletes, all of that. And so with the survey study being done, it helped us inform and design the intervention study. And so the intervention study, like I mentioned last episode, entails a maintenance phase for the subjects, followed by a pretty aggressive diet, followed by one of 3 post-dieting strategies, one of which is the reverse dieting, which is going to directly mirror the results that we got from the survey study. And I told you guys that I'd let you know once that study is IRB approved. And just last week, we got IRB approval for the intervention study, meaning we are opening recruitment and we are literally starting the study. This is the study that I'm leading. It's we need hundreds of subjects for this. Everything is done virtually. So if you are interested in undergoing a maintenance phase and undergoing an aggressive dieting phase and then being assigned to one of 3 post-dieting strategies to see if reverse dieting is efficacious at mitigating weight regain after a dieting phase, please let me know. We do have an email set up for you to express your interest. If you do want to participate in the study, it is reversedietstudy@gmail.com. But if you email me at thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com or you DM me at thevalidypodcast or at VallFitt, I will get back to you. I will give you the information you need so that we can start the onboarding process and see if you're eligible to be a subject in the study. So that is the really freaking exciting news number 1, and I anticipate that you'll start to see a lot of recruitment material come up on your social media in the next few weeks from myself, from the research team members, from Dr. Campbell, and from other kind of people in the space, because we do need a lot of subjects, like I said. So that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to update you guys on. So exciting. We've never had an IRB approval this fast, so shookity shook. Dr. Campbell's this has never happened to me. So yeet, I guess. But we're all very, very excited. And after I finish filming this, I'm going to get ready and go to the lab meeting. And I'll be running the meeting and we'll be making sure that we have all the recruitment material, everything finalized, ready to go, subject documents, because like I said, it came a little bit sooner than we expected. So that's what we got going on. But in terms of personal updates, I think every update that I've given you besides for the last episode was, we're growing, we're pushing food, we're growing, it's uncomfortable, but we're growing and we're growing and we're growing and we're growing. And then last episode, I was we're tightening up. So I haven't officially talked about this. I've been really hesitant to talk about this just for me, myself, and I guess. But I am on prep. I've been on prep for a while. And if you followed along my 2022 season, you know that I posted every little detail of my prep, and I'm really grateful that I did that, and I think that I created a really great community by doing so, and I showed with full transparency what a prep entails. But I also think that it had some drawbacks on my personal mental health, especially when it came to show day outcomes, pressure, people talking, negative things being said to me, about me, pressure, expectations. It took a really big toll, and I think I had this really big anxiety about starting prep this year and feeling like I need to post it. And I started to find myself feeling not am I ready to start prep and is my coach telling me you are ready, Val? But instead I found myself starting to worry will people think that I'm starting this too soon? I've been talking so much about not starting a prep until it's undeniable. Will people think I'm jumping the gun? Will people be oh my God, why is she back in prep? Oh my God, this and that. She's, not pro-worthy. Like that, I started to realize that I was being consumed by the thoughts of other people's opinions. And so I just made the decision for myself, like, I am under no obligation to post about my prep, to post that I am on prep, or any of those things. And, you know, I'm obviously talking about it now, because I do want to share a little bit more about just my day-to-day. And it's very hard for me to do that and like avoid the fact that I'm on prep, mostly because it obviously does take over my day-to-day. I also don't want to like blatantly lie. You know, it's never that I've lied about being on prep. I just haven't highlighted it, mentioned it, or like made that my entire personality or identity. So with that being said, I don't think that I'm going to like announce like, oh, this is my show date. Cause again, for my own mental health, I hope you guys understand that I prep for me. I don't prep for content like I think a lot of people do nowadays. I don't prep for engagement. I don't prep to post pictures of me shredded. I mean, do not get me wrong. I will be posting pictures of me shredded, but I need you guys to understand that that is not what fuels me. That is not what drives me. That is not my motivation. And during the past many, many weeks that I've endured on prep, I've done that for me, myself, and I. My friends have been super supportive. I've had the healthiest prep I've ever had. I've had the healthiest support system. I've been the most engaged in other things. It hasn't consumed me. But just as I get a little bit deeper, there are things that I think are valuable to put out there just in terms of like balancing your life when you are on prep and in grad school. And I think it's a unique experience that I do want to share. But I don't think that I'm going to make it like my personality again. I just don't want to do that because I don't want it to be my personality. And then B, I don't really want to put pressure on like posting about my specific show day because I just want to show the helpful stuff. You know, like how I pack if I'm staying the night at my boyfriend's and I have to bring a gajillion and one things, literally have to bring a carry-on suitcase for one night, plus all my bags, all my food, whatever. How I balance if I have like a really busy exam week with lab and this and podcast and school and gym and I have to get all my prep stuff done. So I'm going to shut up and stop yapping. But the biggest thing I kind of wanted to say was I am on prep. I'll probably post about it on Instagram soon, but I kind of feel like my podcast community knows me a little bit better because you guys are here for the things I actually want to share, which is like educational stuff. So I kind of wanted to announce it on here first, if that makes sense. And I don't know when I'm going to announce it on Instagram, but I kind of want to just start to like lift that curtain because it's getting to the point where I'm like, oh, I can't post this because I haven't talked about being on prep. And I like, that's the point where I'm like, okay, it's time to just talk about it. Not that I even think it's that big a deal. I don't want you guys to think that I think I'm some huge deal and like I'm keeping this a secret. It's genuinely just for my mental because my mental suffered a lot with the outcomes of my last season. So anyways, this is not why you're here. You're here to learn about diet breaks and refeeds. And I think that it is also very pertinent because tomorrow I actually have a refeed and I'm so excited. So, let's talk about it. I don't know if you guys are familiar with diet breaks, with refeeds. The definition of diet breaks and refeeds, they fall under the umbrella term of something called nonlinear dieting. And nonlinear dieting is basically intermittent energy restriction. So you're restricting energy, but not linearly, not continuously. You're doing so in an intermittent fashion. And it can be used as a strategy to attenuate adaptive thermogenesis, thereby increasing weight loss during subsequent periods of energy restriction. So that's a lot of words. What does this mean? We talked about adaptive thermogenesis in the negative consequences of dieting episode and the how dieting can ruin your physique. Adaptive thermogenesis is basically a downregulation of your resting metabolic rate as you undergo a sustained deficit. So the idea is that intermittent energy restriction or diet breaks and refeeds can attenuate this adaptive thermogenesis and therefore make you more responsive to the subsequent periods of energy restriction. So when you go back to the deficit, it's not necessarily saying that you're going to lose more fat on your diet break, but that it can make you susceptible to be more responsive to your deficit once you get back into your deficit. And this involves, like I said, intermittent periods of energy balance throughout the diet, as opposed to just one continuous long-term energy restriction. And there's different ways in which we can incorporate non-linear dieting strategies. There's diet breaks, and there's refeeds. We're going to be looking at 4 diet break studies, I believe, and 1 refeed study, and we're basically going to determine, is it favorable? Like, what happens when we implement these during a dieting phase, during a fat loss phase, compared to not implementing one at all, compared to just continuous dieting? What are the outcome differences, both like physiological and psychological? And do they bring any benefit? Do they slow us down? Do they push back our end goal? Do they make us gain weight? Like, what are the outcomes of implementing these? So for the diet break studies, to define a diet break, it's basically a 1 to 2 week break from your diet where you either go back to maintenance or above. And in some of the studies that we're going to look at, the diet break implemented was a controlled back to maintenance. Some of the diet breaks implemented were ad libitum eating, which you guys know by now just means pop off, kings and queens. You can eat whatever you want and then come back to your deficit. So all of that. And again, the theory is that this break from dieting is going to attenuate adaptive thermogenesis, which is just that decreased weight loss efficiency that we experience as the deficit progresses. So the first diet break study we're going to look at is kind of considered the original diet break study. It was published in 2003, conducted by Wing and Jeffrey, and it is called Prescribed Breaks as a Means to Disrupt Weight Control Efforts. This study had 118 overweight and obese males and females, averaged 43 years old, with an average BMI of 33. And the purpose of the study was to determine if diet breaks would have a negative effect on adherence that would persist past the breaks and reduce overall weight loss success. So in reading this purpose, we know that they kind of went into this with a bias. It sounds like they assume that the breaks might disrupt their behavior and their ability to adhere to the deficit. So they're saying, if we give them a break from their diet, will that disrupt their ability to adhere to their diet afterwards? Will it reduce their overall weight loss success? And so what they did, the deficits that were implemented in the study was either a 1,500 calorie diet or a 1,000 calorie diet based on body weight. And this was a 6-month long study. The actual deficit was 20 weeks long. During this study, they had a list of 13 forbidden foods during their dieting weeks, during their deficit weeks. And these things included things like cheese, burgers, cakes, pastries. It's pretty intuitive what 13 forbidden foods might look like. Not that they should be forbidden. I'm not advocating to cut out any food groups at all. It's just with the specific study implemented. And so the exercise protocol was that exercise increased throughout the duration of the study until they achieved a maximum of 150 minutes of cardio per week. So the subjects were broken up into 3 groups. Remember, if they're in the deficit, they're either consuming 1,500 calories or 1,000 calories based on their body weight. So there was one group that had no diet break. They dieted for 20 weeks straight on their respective deficit. There was another group that had a 6-week-long diet break. And there was a third group that had 3 2-week-long breaks. So in both the diet break groups, there was a total of 6 weeks taken off from dieting in the entire 20-week-long study. However, in one of the diet break groups, it was a continuous 6 weeks diet break. And the other one, it was 3 2-week diet breaks interspersed throughout the 20 weeks. For the 6-week-long diet break group, they dieted for 7 weeks, I believe, then took 6 weeks off and then dieted another 7. And then for the group that had the 3 diet breaks that were each 2 weeks long, they implemented those 2-week diet breaks after week 3, 6, and 9 of the deficit, if that makes sense. And what's interesting is that during this study, the diet breaks where you were allowed your forbidden foods again, you were allowed to do whatever physical activity you wanted, so you didn't have to adhere to any prescribed exercise, and you could eat whatever you want. It's ad libitum eating. There was no prescribed maintenance, no prescribed exercise, no forbidden foods, no anything. And so what they found was that in the 2 diet break groups, during the diet breaks, body weight was either maintained at when they entered the diet break. So if they had lost weight during the deficit, they either maintained that or they slightly gained that during the diet break itself, but eventually reduced their body weight yet again once the dieting recommenced. And interestingly enough, the final change in body weight was the same between all 3 groups. It was the same in the group that had no diet break and dieted for 20 weeks straight, compared to the group that had a 6-week-long diet break in the middle, compared to the group that had 3 diet breaks that were each 2 weeks long. And this is a diet break where you can eat whatever you want. So what the authors kind of said was that experimentally prescribed breaks in adherence to weight loss programs have no negative impact on weight loss. So to me, I'm hearing this, and I don't know if I would necessarily, with one of my clients, have them in a deficit and then say, hey, take 6 weeks to eat whatever you want. But I take this as if we're in the middle of a dieting phase and you have a vacation coming up. If you're in the middle of a dieting phase or you have a conference for work coming up, you have something where we need to take a step back from the deficit. We have literal data from 118 subjects that tells us to rest assured that that's not going to be detrimental to our weight loss efforts so long as we come back to the deficit. I do want to be clear that this deficit was pretty aggressive. And I also want to be clear that these subjects were overweight and obese individuals that were untrained. So they're not resistance trained. And we know that those two populations sometimes respond differently. We cannot treat them as synonymous populations. But for all intents and purposes, I think this is really valuable data that tells us that if we prescribe occasional breaks from a program, it might be useful, especially if it's something like a holiday or a vacation coming up, to tell us, hey, it's not going to be detrimental to your weight loss efforts so long as you come back on the deficit. So that's diet break study number 1. Diet break study number 2, it was published in 2018, and it is intermittent energy restriction improves weight loss deficiency in obese men, the Matador study. And this was published by Byrne et al. And basically in this study, they had 36 obese males, about 40 years old and about 39% body fat. And the purpose of the study was to determine if intermittent energy restriction improves weight loss efficiency. So in the first study, their purpose was, do breaks from dieting harm you? And this one is, do breaks in dieting help you? So it's different sides of the exact same coin, but I just think it's interesting as the science evolves, how your perspective as a researcher also is going to evolve as you form your hypotheses, because previous data has to inform the hypotheses that you make going into every new study. And so again, in the study, they implemented diet breaks to try to counter this adaptive thermogenesis that we've talked about. And so they had 2 groups. They had a continuous dieting group and they had a diet break group. In the continuous group, they had 4 weeks at maintenance, followed by 16 weeks of a continuous diet that consisted of a 33% deficit, and then 8 weeks of a post-diet period. In the diet break group, they had 4 weeks at maintenance, followed by a 30-week period of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off dieting. The 2 weeks on was again a 33% deficit, and the 2 weeks off dieting, so the 2-week diet breaks, was back to maintenance. And then also followed by an 8-week post-diet phase. So this already has some differences. 1, the diet break is back to maintenance. It is not ad libitum. And 2, we're doing 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So 2 weeks of deficit, 2 weeks of diet break, 2 weeks of deficit, 2 weeks of diet break. And it's important to note that in this group, that period of dieting and diet breaking is 30 weeks long compared to the continuous group that is only 16 weeks of continuous dieting, but it amounts to the same amount of time spent in the actual deficit. So in this specific study, the diet breaks are prolonging the overall endpoint. So 16 weeks of continuous dieting versus 30 weeks of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off dieting. But the deficit percentage is the same, 33% deficit. And so what they found was that the diet break group lost significantly more weight. So they lost about 14 kilograms of body mass compared to 9 in the continuous group. So the continuous group lost, like I said, 9 kilograms of body weight, 8 of which were body fat, and 1 of which was lean mass. And they had a downregulation of the resting metabolic rate of 179 calories. So their resting metabolic rate dropped by 179 calories. The diet break group lost 14 kilograms of body mass, 12 of which were body fat. So they lost 12 kilos of fat compared to 8 in the continuous group. And they lost 2 kilos of lean mass, but their RMR only downregulated by 86 calories. And so what we see here is that intermittent energy restriction induces greater weight loss and greater fat loss without greater lean mass loss and with an attenuation of your RMR downregulation. So let me dissect this in more words. The differences in body weight was statistically significant. The differences in body fat were statistically significant. The differences in the lean mass lost was not statistically significant. The difference in RMR was statistically significant. So what this means is that in the group that implemented the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off of dieting for 30 weeks, they lost significantly more body weight, more body fat, and their RMR did not decrease as much without any significant differences to their lean mass, which we know if we lose lean mass, that's where we run the risk of all the negative consequences of dieting. So what we're seeing here is that, yes, it took them more time, but they got better results and they accelerated the amount of body fat that they were able to lose without compromising their lean tissue. So this study, combined with the first study, is starting to really paint this picture. Do you guys notice how much I say really paints the picture? This is painting a picture. I got to find a synonym for that, seriously. But these two studies are painting a picture that intermittent energy restriction, implementing diet breaks, might actually be favorable. In the first study, it did not change the overall final endpoint of the diet, so it didn't make them take longer time. In the second study, it did extend the endpoint significantly, but in both studies, the diet break had favorable responses. In the first study, again, it's not that the diet break group did better, but the diet break group did not cause any differences in outcome. So I would personally, if I have to diet for 20 weeks, I would rather diet for 20 weeks with some breaks in there or with a fat 6-week break in there than no break at all. And then in the second group, the diet break group did do better. It did have better outcomes, but at the expense of it taking longer time. So these two studies are not necessarily saying that diet breaks are necessary to see these favorable results, but they're definitely not going to be detrimental, and that you can get some favorable results out of them at the cost of extending your diet a little bit longer. Another thing to note is that both of these studies were done on overweight or obese individuals. So it's time to kind of look at what do diet breaks and intermittent energy restriction look like in resistance trained individuals, because like I said, untrained and trained populations are not interchangeable, at least not in the science. So going into our third diet break study. This was published in 2021, and it is the continuous versus intermittent dieting for fat loss and fat-free mass retention in resistance-trained adults. The ICE-CAP trial for short. And you guys know that the moment I see fat-free mass retention, it's music to my ears. It should be music to your ears at this point. But this was a study done by Pios et al., again in 2021. So the first one was focusing, do breaks ruin your diet? The second one was, do breaks help your diet? This one is, do breaks specifically help you retain more muscle mass during your diet in resistance trained individuals? So in this study, they had two different groups. Both groups had 5 weeks at maintenance. The intermittent energy restriction group had then 15 weeks of 3 weeks of dieting, followed by 1 week at maintenance, then back to 3 weeks of dieting, 1 week at maintenance. So this is 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And the 3 weeks of dieting was a 35% deficit. The continuous energy restriction group, so the group without diet breaks, did 12 weeks of dieting, followed by 3 weeks at maintenance. So 12 weeks of the 35% deficit, and then 3 weeks at maintenance. What's important is that in this study, both groups had 15-week-long dieting periods, including the maintenance phases. So one was 15 weeks of 3 weeks on, 1 week off. The other one was 15 weeks of 12 weeks on, followed by 3 weeks of maintenance. And again, the diet breaks in this study were back to maintenance. And both groups had standardized protein of 2.3 grams per kilogram of body mass. So pretty high protein intake. If you remember the rapid fat loss episodes where we discussed different protein intakes that you should be implementing when undergoing a dieting phase to reduce the negative consequences and to maximize lean mass retention. So in the study, they had 49 males and females, resistance trained, averaging around 29 years old. And what they found was absolutely no difference between the groups. They lost between 7.7 to 9 pounds of body weight, which is about a 3% body weight reduction. They only lost 1 pound of fat-free mass, and they had an 11% downregulation in their RMR. So again, this is either 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or 12 weeks straight followed by 3 weeks at maintenance. And there was absolutely no detriment by implementing a diet break every 3 weeks, which I'm thinking about a prep. I'm like, if every 3 weeks I got a diet break, bro, I'd be living. I'm like fiending for my refeed tomorrow. Anyways, so there were no difference in the physiological outcomes, okay? In terms of body weight, body fat, lean mass, RMR downregulation. However, they looked at psychological outcomes too, and they found that hunger and desire to eat was increased in the continuous energy restriction group compared to the intermittent energy restriction group. So meaning in the group that dieted for 12 weeks straight, there was an increase in hunger and an increase in desire to eat compared to the group that had a diet break every 3 weeks. I think that's important. I think that's important because one, we're seeing this increase in hunger and this increase in the desire to eat without necessarily a huge decrease in fat-free mass, which we've discussed is what we think could be driving hyperphagia after a diet. And this isn't necessarily that hyperphagia was seen. I think this is more of a mental, just psychological outcome where clearly dieting for 12 weeks straight increases maybe your food focus, your desire to indulge in those foods. So again, there were no differences in the physiological outcomes of body weight, body fat, lean mass, RMR. But if we're not going to see a difference in those things, I personally would rather have decreased hunger and decreased desire to eat, which was seen in that group that had 3 weeks on, 1 week off. The last study we're going to look at in diet breaks was actually conducted at USF. It was published in 2023 by Dr. Campbell, and it is the effects of intermittent diet breaks during 25% energy restriction on body composition and resting metabolic rate in resistance-trained females. So again, we are resistance-trained, but this is females only, which is pretty unique. In this study, they did 6 weeks straight of dieting, or 2 weeks on, 1 week off for 8 weeks. So again, this is another one of those studies where the endpoint is being pushed off a little bit because you're implementing those breaks. But in both weeks, they did have 6 weeks of actual deficit time. So the deficit here was 25%, and the diet break here was back to maintenance. Protein was standardized at 1.8 grams per kilogram of body mass, and they did do resistance training. It was supervised, and it was 3 times a week. So again, this is either 6 weeks straight of dieting or 2 weeks on, 1 week off for 8 weeks. And what they found was, again, no changes in body composition or in RMR between the groups. They lost about 1.5 to 3 pounds of fat mass. They either lost or gained about a pound of lean muscle, so just plus or minus 1 pound of lean muscle, so no real change in their lean mass. And they actually had an upregulation of their RMR by about 12 to 13 calories. This is probably because they were resistance training during this study, and the other studies did not implement supervised resistance training. And what Dr. Campbell did and the researchers did is they looked at weight trends during the actual diet breaks. And so, like I said, they did end up losing body weight at the end of the 8 weeks. But during the 2 diet breaks that they had, the scale trended up about 0.3 pounds during the first diet break and about 0.5 pounds during the second diet break. Keep in mind, this is average. Some subjects did actually lose weight during the actual diet breaks, but on average, there were small fluctuations upwards in the scale of about 0.3 or 0.5 pounds during the actual diet break weeks, after which it came back down once they recontinued the deficit. So I think this is really, really valuable data, more so because A, it confirms that diet breaks are not going to harm your success in a weight loss phase if you're able to recommence your deficit after a diet break. And then B, if you are implementing a diet break or you're on prep or you're in a strict dieting phase and you're given a diet break, you're given a refeed, sometimes it's terrifying if you start to see that scale creep up and you're like, oh my God, this diet break is pushing me back. Oh my God, like I'm regressing, like I'm gaining weight. This data, the fact that they reported trends of how the scale on average fluctuated during those diet breaks, but then also how it came back down, is really valuable to help us have the peace of mind that if that scale does fluctuate during a diet break, that is okay. That has been documented in the literature. It is normal. And as long as we recommence our deficit afterwards, we're still going to see success in our fat loss phase. And so the biggest takeaway from the physiological outcomes of the study, at least according to Dr. Campbell, was that there were no differences in the groups because 6 weeks might not be long enough to need a diet break. Diet breaks are typically more beneficial once you diet to the point of almost like needing that diet break. And Dr. Campbell speculates that the 6 week straight dieting was just not long enough to downregulate adaptive thermogenesis significantly to where a diet break could actually help you. So that was his speculation. But they did do some psychological and qualitative surveying in this study. And they found that between the continuous group and the diet break group, there was a significant difference between the groups for disinhibition ratings. And disinhibition describes a lack of control of overeating or a tendency to lose control and overeat, usually in response to stimuli like hyperpalatable food. So when administered surveys that asked a bunch of questions, including questions about disinhibition, they found that in the continuous group, disinhibition actually increased over the dieting period, so it increased over time. And in the diet break group, disinhibition actually decreased over time. So their disinhibition ratings decreased throughout the duration of the diet. And this is interesting because they were given these surveys, I believe, once a week. And disinhibition is one of those things that usually upregulates when you're in a dieting phase. And if we're not going to be causing any detriment to our actual outcomes of fat loss, to our actual outcomes of fat mass retention, of RMR downregulation, then why wouldn't you extend your diet a week or two if it means that you get to throw some diet breaks in there and decrease the hunger, decrease the desire to eat like we saw in the other study, and decrease our disinhibition? Because hunger, desire to eat, and disinhibition are all things that can set you up for a pretty rough time after the diet. And again, we don't have a lot of data as to what to do after a diet, hence our reverse dieting intervention study that we are actively recruiting for. So please do not forget to reach out if you want to be a subject for that. But we don't have a lot of data as to what to do after a diet, but we can probably speculate and conceptualize that an increase in hunger and desire to eat and disinhibition are not really setting you up for like the easiest time post-diet. So something to keep in mind. Anyways, those are the 4 diet break studies that we looked at in class. And so we're going to go into our final study we're looking at, which is a refeed study. And refeeds are typically different from diet breaks in that diet breaks are 1 to 2 weeks long. You know, in one study it was 6 weeks long. And refeeds are typically more acute. They're usually a day or two. My refeed, for example, tomorrow is unfortunately just tomorrow. But when you're in a prep and you do have a strict endpoint, I don't have the luxury of throwing in a bunch of diet breaks and prolonging my endpoint. So again, that is a give and take that you have to think about when you're conceptualizing the results of these diet break studies. It's okay, there was no detriment. In some of them, there was actually a benefit to diet breaking, but in some of them, it was at the expense of prolonging the end goal a little bit. So instead of 6 weeks, you know, the diet break group was 8 weeks. One of them, instead of, I think it was 15 weeks, the diet break group was 30 weeks. So again, it is kind of like a push and pull, a give and take of figuring out what your end goal is, how strict is your temporal endpoint, and working backwards to determine, can I implement diet breaks in here for a more favorable outcome at the expense of it taking a little bit longer? If you're not in a rush, I wouldn't even question it. Plan your diet breaks, throw them in there. If you're in a prep and, you know, you have a more strict endpoint, you don't have the luxury of just pushing back a week or two, maybe a refeed is a better alternative. So let's get straight into that. This refeed study was also done at USF. Shout out Dr. Campbell for being one of the most freaking prolific fat loss researchers on this planet. And this is called The Intermittent Energy Restriction Attenuates the Loss of Fat-Free Mass in Resistance-Trained Individuals. It was published, again, by Dr. Campbell in 2020. And this is, again, looking at that lean mass retention while dieting. Again, music to my ears, should be music to your ears. If you haven't noticed, Dr. Campbell, it is a fat loss lab largely, or it has been historically, but it's mostly fat loss with the goal of preserving lean mass, because that is where the detriments of deficits and of dieting really come in. So in the study, they had 27 resistance-trained males and females, about 25 years old and averaging 21% body fat. And these subjects were randomly assigned to one of 2 diets for 7 weeks total. There was a flexible diet with intermittent carb refeeds. And so what this means is that during the weekdays, Monday through Friday, they were at a 25% deficit. And then during the weekends, they got a 2-day refeed where they went back to their caloric maintenance, but the only thing that increased from the deficit to the maintenance was carbohydrates. So all of the extra calories for the refeeds came from carbohydrates. Their protein was standardized at 1.6 grams per kilogram of body mass, so that didn't change. Fats didn't change, and so your deficit was created by reducing your carbs during the week and then bringing them back up to maintenance during the weekend. So 5 days of dieting followed by 2 days of refeeds. The second group was a continuous flexible diet. Flexible diet just means that it was macro tracking style, if that makes sense. But the continuous flexible diet was at a 25% deficit every single day. Their protein was standardized at 1.6 grams per kilogram of body mass, and they did not get any refeeds. It was 7 weeks of straight dieting. So again, the refeed group had 5 days of a 25% deficit followed by 2 days back at maintenance on the weekends for 7 weeks. And then the continuous group just had a 25% deficit for 7 weeks straight. No refeeds, no anything. They had 1 hour per week of cardio, and they were resistance training 4 times a week. What they found was that there was no statistically significant differences in fat loss between the two groups, but the refeed group had significantly less lean mass lost. So they lost less lean mass, but the same amount of body fat. That right there is probably the most favorable, desirable outcome for a dieting phase. It's you get weekend refeeds, you lose just as much body fat as if you didn't have any refeeds, but you actually held on to your lean mass more. And we know, I'm not going to go into it again, we know the importance of preserving your lean mass in a dieting phase. This difference was actually pretty huge. The continuous group without the refeeds lost 1.3 kilos of lean mass. That's like 3 pounds or something of lean mass. The refeed group lost less than half a kilo. They lost 0.4 kilos of lean mass. That's a pound. That's a pretty significant difference. The other significant difference they found was that the group without refeeds had a much larger downregulation of the resting metabolic rate. So their RMR went down by 78 calories versus the refeed group that went down by 40 calories. And again, this was statistically significant. So we've talked about how your RMR is largely tied to and linked to your lean mass. We've talked about how your number one goal in a dieting phase is to lose body fat, but that right under that, your goal should be to preserve lean mass. And so in this 7-week diet study, they found that if you take your weekends back at maintenance, you don't compromise your fat loss efforts or outcomes at all, but you actually improve your lean mass retention outcomes and your RMR downregulation outcomes. So what this study tells us is that having weekly intermittent carbohydrate refeeds back to maintenance during a dieting phase actually helps preserve your lean mass and preserve your RMR. And if I'm thinking about this in my head, I'm just wondering if those carbs are translating into better training performance, better training efficacy. I don't know. There were no performance metrics measured during this specific study, but I have to just assume that you're going into your week more refreshed. You're going into your week with a better training headspace, better training mindset, and maybe that's translating into more favorable outcomes when it comes to lean mass preservation during a dieting phase. I don't know, but if you ask me which one I would rather do, 7 weeks straight of 25% deficit every single day, or if I get to go back to maintenance on the weekends, that's like not even a question for me. I'm taking the refeeds. And if anything, I'm glad I'm revisiting this study right now because I have a refeed tomorrow, and you know, on prep, sometimes it gets a little bit scary. You start to wonder like, am I being a pussy? Like, should I just be suffering through my deficit every single day? Like, do I really need this refeed? Am I not hard enough? No, Val. Clearly, this refeed is going to have some benefits. So personally for me, going through all this research on diet breaks and refeeds, it's really just validating the fact that I am going to enjoy the fuck out of my refeed tomorrow. In case you guys are wondering. So excited. Okay. So that's what I have pretty much for the science, the studies of diet breaks and refeeds. If we're going to recap, we know that diet breaks typically are 1 to 2 weeks long, but we do have some 6-week long diet breaks recorded in the literature. They typically result in the same outcome as if you were continuously dieting, or in improved outcomes when it comes to lean mass preservation and body fat loss and body weight loss and RMR downregulation. But those benefits usually come at the expense of pushing back your overall endpoint a little bit and just allowing more time in your overall dieting phase so that you can incorporate these weekly long diet breaks. When it comes to refeeds, we talked about one study. Again, it is way more acute. It is only a 2-day refeed, but it's every single week. And it resulted in no differences in body fat loss, but actually improved your lean mass and RMR preservation. So the overall verdict, if you ask me, between diet breaks and refeeds, I mean, if we're taking them together and we're talking about nonlinear dieting in general, I think there's a clear winner that nonlinear dieting should be the approach. If you take a little bit longer and you implement some diet breaks, you're also not compromising at all the actual outcomes of your diet, your body fat loss, your body weight loss, your lean mass preservation. You're not compromising those, and if anything, you might be helping those. But if you are pressed for time and you don't have the luxury of, adding 2 weeks to your dieting phase so that you can implement 2 1-week refeeds or 1 2-week refeed or whatever it may be, and you find yourself in a pretty aggressive deficit feeling a little bit run down, don't be scared to throw a refeed in there, to take a weekend back to maintenance. Do not be scared to throw in a refeed day or 2. There is no data suggesting that that's going to push back your fat loss efforts. And if anything, there's data suggesting that that's going to help your lean mass preservation efforts. And again, this is almost me preaching to me because of my refeed tomorrow. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I'm no longer kind of hesitant for it. I am going to indulge in it and know that it's probably going to help me according to the science. So my overall point of view when it comes to non-linear dieting, if you don't have a hard deadline and you have the luxury of adding 1 to 2 weeks to your total time, and then you get to add in 1 to 2 diet breaks throughout your dieting period, I think that's going to be beneficial because you're going to decrease the likelihood that you experience hunger, that you experience an increased desire to eat, that you experience an increase in disinhibition, which is just going to set you up for a more successful post-dieting phase. But also, you're not going to compromise any of your actual outcomes of body fat loss, lean mass retention, all of that. On the flip side, if you're prepping or you're dieting for something specific and you don't have the luxury of extending it, the science suggests that there is no detriment whatsoever to implementing a 1 to 2 day refeed where you bring your calories back to maintenance via an increase in carbohydrates. In fact, not only is there no detriment to your body fat loss outcomes, but there's actually a benefit in preserving your lean mass and preserving your resting metabolic rate. So again, if you don't have the luxury of time, I think a refeed is an incredible strategy to implement in order to get some favorable and desirable outcomes out of your dieting phase. If you do have the luxury of time, I think you're just going to have a way more enjoyable dieting experience with the same, if not better, outcomes if you give yourself the time to add in a couple diet breaks throughout your fat loss phase. So that is my overall recap, point of view, takeaway from the diet break and refeed literature that we looked at today. When it comes to my personal implementation, obviously I have a coach, but we did start off my prep with carb cycling, which is a form of implementing refeeds. I implement carb cycling a lot in my clients' deficits, and a lot of times they ask me like, hey, I'm just curious, what is the science behind this? And I love being able to say it theoretically attenuates the adaptive thermogenesis that we experience whenever we are dieting, and that can actually make you more susceptible to respond better to the subsequent deficits when you come back to your deficit after the refeed or after the diet break. Also, it might just help us preserve more lean mass when it comes to carb cycling, when it comes to, acute refeed implementations. And the biggest takeaway that we kind of talked about in class and that Dr. Campbell really kind of harped on was that every time that refeeds or diet breaks were successful or effective that he has seen is when they come back to maintenance. So his personal experience with refeed implementation and diet break implementation, I know we looked at some studies where the diet breaks were ad libitum or, no guidance as to what you can eat, no restriction. His personal experience is that any time that they were effective was when it was coming back to maintenance, not above maintenance, not below maintenance. So that's also a nice guideline for you to have. Sometimes it's really scary to implement a refeed because you're A, terrified that you're going to do a disservice to your fat loss efforts, but also B, it's like, okay, how much do I refeed? If you have an idea of your maintenance intake, bring your caloric intake back to that. Create that increase via an increase in carbohydrates. Protein should be standardized and fats should be sufficient for hormonal health. And they shouldn't really need to change all that much in a refeed. And increase carbs back to your maintenance intake. So that's what I got for you today. I feel like this was a slightly shorter episode, but I probably yapped a little bit on the front end. So it probably equaled out to be yet another fatty, potentially. I don't know. I'll see when I edit. But quick reminder. If you want to be a subject in the world's first reverse dieting intervention study and the largest study that we've ever done in Dr. Campbell's lab, please email reversedietstudy@gmail.com. It will be in the description below. You can also always reach out to my email, thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com for clarification, questions, or just general things you want me to cover in podcasts. You can also DM me at my podcast Instagram, which is The Validity Podcast, or my personal at VallFitt, VallFitt. My programs and my one-on-one coaching application are also in the description below if you do want to work together. Everything that you kind of learn through these podcasts are conversations that I have with my clients every week, and what's obviously strategies that I implement every time that they are pertinent, necessary, and applicable. So yeah, I don't think that there's anything else for me to cover. I'm so excited to continue sharing, my prep journey and to eventually step on stage whenever that time comes. It's been a very different prep, a very low stress prep, all things considered. It's the highest my food has ever been in a prep. It's the lowest my cardio has ever been in a prep. I'm already down over 15 pounds. And I'm just feeling good. I'm feeling so lucky and so supported. I have an amazing, amazing support system. I'm just feeling grateful, okay? Because it's been a really pleasant prep experience so far comparative to all the other arduous ass preps I've done. I mean, for reference, and then I'm going to shut up, I promise. For reference, my last prep, I started my prep at 20 weeks out for my 2022 season, which, spoiler alert, ended up being 30 and 40 weeks out. So at 30 and 40 weeks out, my cardio was at an hour and my carbs were at 150. And I'm however many weeks into prep now and however many weeks out, just know that I've been prepping for a minute. And my cardio is only at 30 minutes. And my carbs are at 150, which again, it's not high, it's low. I'm starving. But for reference, that's where I started my prep at 30 weeks out. That's insanity. I started my prep at 60 minutes of cardio a day. That was not my doing. That was my old coach's doing. I'm not going to talk about that. But needless to say, it's just been a very different prep experience and different in the best way. And I'm just very excited. And again, I don't know when I'll step on stage, but when the time comes, I'm just excited. I'm nervous as heck. But I'm excited nonetheless. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you do implement refeeds, if you do implement diet breaks, definitely let me know how that goes. Let me know if you have any questions. And I'm excited to kind of get this going on a more updated time frame now that the episodes are kind of going more in alignment with what's actually going on in real time as they drop. So I'll keep you guys updated on everything. I love you guys, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next episode.